All right, so we've got a pretty cool experiment today. We're going to measure absolute zero, the coldest possible temperature, and we're going to do it without even getting that cold, or using a conventional thermometer. What we're going to be using is the relationship between pressure and temperature in a gas and this device, which is basically just a hollow steel sphere connected by a tube to a pressure gauge up here. So right now it's reading a little over 24. This is in PSI, I think, but it turns out the units don't really matter. What matters is if you take this ball and put it in some cold water so the temperature goes down, the pressure will go down, and we put it in some hot water, the pressure and temperature will both go up together. So what that looks like on a graph of pressure versus temperature is, say this is 0 C and this is 100 C. We would measure one pressure down here in the ice, and then when we heat up the bulb to boiling, we would measure a higher pressure. And so from these two pressure and temperature measurements, what we can do is sort of extrapolate backwards, and this line should point to absolute zero. And so we'll test that out. What we can do is, I've got the bulb kind of already pressurized, so we can measure these 2 points, and then what we'll do next is open the valve while the bulb is hot. So it'll be up here, but then the pressure will go down because we opened it up. And will be a lower pressure, but still at 100 C. We'll measure that pressure, and then we'll put it in the ice water and measure that pressure, which should be even lower. So then we'll get another line that points to absolute zero. And then what we can do is open it while it's in the ice water. The pressure will go up a little bit. We'll measure that, and then put it back in the boiling water, measure it one last time, and now what we have is a set of 3 lines that should all be pointing back to absolute zero. So we'll get those measurements, and then we can kind of compare the 3 different lines and see how well they agree in terms of pointing us to a value for absolute zero. Okay, I think we're ready to get some measurements. If you want to follow along, we'll be filling out the table on page 2. But I've got my constant volume gas thermometer here. Pressure is about 23 or 24. And I'm going to start by putting it in the ice. We'll give it a minute to sit there, and we'll see where it is. As you can see, that's dropping already. So I'll let this sit for a minute, and we'll check back and see where it ends up at once it's cooled down all the way. Okay, our CVGT has been sitting in the ice for a couple minutes. And it looks like, I'm going to call that a pressure of about 20, maybe 21.6. So on our table, that would be the first entry here. And what we can do is now move it into move it into the boiling water. So again, we'll let this sit for a minute. It's going to take the water a minute to come back to the boil. You can see the pressure is going up already. We'll just let that get back to a boil, and we'll check again on the pressure in a minute. Okay, we've been sitting in the boiling water for a little while, long enough for it to get back to a boil. And I'm pretty confident everything in there is the same temperature now. And it looks like our pressure reading now is maybe 29.2 or so. So that would go here. So we got 2 readings now. This would be enough to make a line and get a value for absolute zero, but we're going to keep collecting data. What I'm going to do is open up the valve while we're in here. I don't know if I can do this with one hand, but I'll try. I'm going to have to set the phone down. You can see this is just like a Schrader valve like you might find on a bike tire or something. So just push the pin in and it vents. So now we've got a pressure. I'll give it a minute to settle, but it looks like just under 16. Like I said, we'll let this settle for just a minute. I'll read it and we'll come back. Okay, so now that we've been sitting in the boiling water for a little bit, we've got a steady reading here and it's pretty close to 16. I'm gonna call that maybe 15.8. And so that's gonna go in our next row right here. This is the low pressure CVGT now because I vented it while it was in the hot water. So, what did I say, 15.8, and now we can transfer it to the cold water, let it settle, and then we'll get that ice reading for this low pressure CVGT. Again, you can see the pressure dropping, but we'll let it sit for a little bit and get a reading once it's all. Okay, now that we've been in the ice for a little while, ready to get our cold reading on this one, and let's see. Let me line up the camera so we can get a good reading. I think we're right about, looks like it's just past halfway point there, so maybe 11.6. So that's going to go here on the ice point. So we've got our pressures for the low pressure CVGT. So now what I'm going to do is vent it again while it's in the ice. And this should go back up to about 15. And again, we'll let that sit for just a minute. Before we get a reading. It's pretty close to 15, but we'll just make sure it's all settled. We'll read it and then put it in the hot water for our last measurement. Alright, looks like we settled on a pressure here. I'm going to call that maybe 15.2, and we'll get ready, move back into the boiling water. And again, we'll have to wait for this. You can see it gets the pressure pretty quickly, but we just want to make sure that it's heated all the way to 100 C before we read it. That's why I keep waiting. But this is going to be a 15.2 for our medium pressure CVGT. And looks like this reading is going to be about 20-21. Again, we'll let it sit for a minute. Make sure this gets back to a full boil before we read it. Alright, I think we can get our hot reading now. Lining up in the steam here, I'm going to call that a 20.6. So that's our medium pressure CVGT hot reading. So now that we've got all those measurements, we can put together a graph and get our 3 lines and 3 values for absolute zero. So if you remember, we started with the pressurized constant volume gas thermometer, read it in the ice down here. That was the 21.6. And then we put it in the hot water. So this is the 29.2. Then we vented it and went down to low pressure. So this would be 15.8. And then moving back to the cold water, this would be 11.6 here. And then we vented it a final time, moving up to medium pressure. So this would be 15.2, and then back to the hot water for 20.6. So if you graph these 6 points and use a ruler, you can project them back. And if you have the graph set up properly, if you have some good graph paper, if you did it better than I did here, because you can see I'm going off the page. These points were just kind of sketched in too, but you can see how each of these is going to give you a value for absolute zero by where it crosses the x-axis. So if I just draw these all in, You can see at least my sketch, they managed to kind of all be headed the same direction. So hopefully yours is a little better than that. But I think this should be enough to get us some pretty decent results.